with me today Jeffrey Wick.
You remove that personal responsibility, these children become adults, and now they want the government to assume that same role.
Welcome to Heritage of Truth. My name is Patty. I have with me today Jeffrey Wick. Jeffrey has been a teacher, principal. He has some interesting things to say about our school system. And would you like to show us the cover of your book? And
Sure.
Public Education, the Final Solution in the Conquest of America's
Ideals. I'm concerned, obviously, about the direction our country's going.
Mm-hmm.
And I think unless we make some decisions or do some things differently, I think America will continue to go down a road of moral relativism, immoral behavior, and to the point of a socialist country, which is not what we are founded upon.
How does that figure into a socialist country? Explain that a little bit.
That's a good question. I think what happens is in the school systems, the schools have become responsible for pretty much every facet of a child's life, from education to diet to social skills to whatever. If anything the child needs, the school steps in and gives it. If we need children to graduate from high school, the counselor does X amount of things to make sure that child does what they're supposed to do, while the child just sits back and receives and the parent sits back and receives. So I think what happens is, from the school doing so much, a dependent mentality arises. And as students are accustomed to that through 12, 13 years in a public school system, when they come out, that dependence is still there. They transfer it to government instead of the schools. And that allows the government to step in and be the parent, and that's how you have a socialist society, through the public school system.
I've never thought about it quite that way, but that's very interesting. And as a teacher myself, I have seen that happen. That's real interesting. So you mentioned in your book 3 cornerstones that are being attacked.
Correct.
Explain that to me.
Well, I think we have 3 cornerstones of American greatness. And in my book, Public Education, I talk about those 3 cornerstones, which are family, faith, and patriotism. And the schools attack all those things. We kind of talked about family a little bit. The schools are doing so much that it destroys, essentially the school becomes the parent. So the parents lose the authority. Who steps in to replace the parent? The school, which is government. The school also attacks faith. We've written Christianity pretty much out of our history through revisionist history. We can't pray in the schools anymore. We can't. In some places, you can't even sing a Christmas carol. It's right. Christian-based. It's all secular music and stuff like that. So they attack faith. If you reduce people's trust in God, they have to trust in somebody. It just doesn't go away. Again, the school steps in, or the government comes in. So that's the second cornerstone they attack. And this idea of separation of church and state, it's not real. It's a fantasy. There's always a faith guiding the system. And it's going to be Christianity, which is what we were founded on, or it's going to be this big government ideals, socialism, relativism, environmentalism. I think those all have come in and replaced our Christian faith. The third one is patriotism. And the reason I say patriotism is because America is the one country that has protected, proclaimed, and advanced freedom throughout the world. Right. We're the one country that's prevented aristocracy or tyranny from taking over the world. So if you destroy America and it's no longer there to defend liberty, then tyranny easily takes over. So those are the 3 cornerstones that I think are attacked in the public school system, as well as in culture in general.
That's very interesting. That's going to take some thinking.
It can get pretty deep. Yes, it can.
Yes, it does. As we're thinking about those cornerstones, so many times I have heard that we are not allowed to speak of our faith. We're not allowed to, because of the separation of church and state, supposedly. The natural progression of that is to have Christmas carols taken out. We no longer call Christmas vacation. It's a winter holiday.
Right,
Excuse
right.
me. So how can parents, I know the one thing a public school fears more than anything is a parent. So how can parents or teachers stand up for what are we within our rights?
You do have some rights out there, yeah, absolutely. I mean, to say Christmas break, there's no problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
Schools are just making choices. There's no court in the land that I've heard of that has sued a school or a parent has sued a school for saying Christmas vacation. Again, we have Christmas vacation for one reason, Christmas. Not for any other, not because of snow,
Right.
not because it's winter, whatever the case may be. So you can say Christmas vacation, and in my school we do. When I get on the announcements or I put out a newsletter, it says Christmas vacation. It doesn't say winter. You got to be careful. There is a line that you can't cross. I mean, we can't go to students and say, you know what, I think you should become a Christian for these reasons. But you can, as a history teacher, I taught our Christian history.
Mm-hmm.
I taught that the Mayflower Compact had a focus on glorifying God. You know, I talked about during the Civil War, the Battle Hymn of the Republic was a focus on Jesus and whatnot. And there's multitudes of quotes by the founders which emphasize Christianity. I taught that. That's part of our history. Mm-hmm. That's legal and it's okay to do. If students want to express their faith, they are allowed to do so, as long as they're not disrupting the school or the classroom. They're writing a paper, they're wearing a t-shirt, and things like that. They may pray at lunch or something, but they're not disrupting anybody else or forcing anybody else. And those are all fine. So it's just a matter of understanding what you can do and being confident to do so.
Great. You mentioned a few things about public schools promoting socialism and how our country is headed in that direction. Can you explain to me in depth a little bit more about that?
Well, especially at the high school level, you see this. When we have students who just aren't doing what they're supposed to do. And part of this goes back, I think, to some of the federal legislation, like No Child Left Behind, because schools are held accountable for meeting a certain standard. Mm-hmm. And if students aren't passing a certain amount of tests or graduating at a certain rate, that ends up being put on the school. So the school decides, in order for this child to graduate, I'm going to set up a tutoring session. And I'm going to remind him to come to that tutoring session. And if he forgets to come, I'm going to remind him again. Then I'm going to call the parent and remind her. Then I'm going to write a letter home to the parent and remind him. Then if they forget the tutoring, we still give them the test. So they fail the test. Now we got to go through the whole process again. And essentially, that's just one example. What happens with grades, report cards. If a kid is failing for, say, the 9 weeks, a parent gets a report card that says F. One of their first reactions is, well, why didn't the school let me know? Well, one of my reactions is, why aren't you involved in your child and why don't you know? But instead, the school now has to make phone calls, send out newsletters, post things on the internet, do all kind of things for the parent and the child to succeed. And the child just sits back and kind of goes through the motions, and we get them to where they need to get to. And again, that puts the dependence factor. I'm going to depend on my teacher to remind me. I'm going to depend on my guidance counselor to do it for me. I'm going to depend on everybody, so the dependent mindset grows. They expect it.
No personal responsibility
Nope.
for your
Absolutely.
own actions or your own goals in life.
Exactly.
Basically.
You remove that personal responsibility, these children become adults, and now they want the government to assume that same role. And I personally believe government is advocating that type of position. Here, we're going to make you dependent on us. Just like recently there was a report that the government is trying to encourage more people to take food stamps. Why would the government want to encourage people to be dependent on government? Because there's a goal there, and that goal is to create a socialist society where people depend on government, and government is strong.
I've read something recently that it was comparing this particular mindset to the mindset of when we had slaves, because basically we were saying to the slaves, you are not capable of taking care of yourself. We have to provide all of these things for you. And it's really keeping people on that lower poverty level. It's not letting them rise up of their own initiative and their own accord.
That's absolutely correct. It's the exact same mentality. The only difference is we're not put in bondage, we don't have chains, we're not
Right.
getting beat, but there's still somebody controlling us and what we can do. And I think another good example is in the state of Virginia, they put out a memo one time concerning school breakfast. And to keep it brief, it said something along the lines of, we want the state's children to be healthy.
Oh my goodness.
Okay, the state's children. They are not the state's children.
No.
They are parents' children. And when you have that mindset running a system, that's promoting socialism in society.
We've had some things on our local news about parents who packed their child's lunch, getting a note sent back to them, or having the lunch taken away, and they were given a lunch provided by the school because the lunch was not nutritionally balanced, even though it had, protein and a fruit.
Right. And
Some of those things, it's mind-blowing how far this can go.
it is, and I've read about that, particular incidents. And, in my book, again, Public Education, I hit on some things that the school's doing, a list of things that they do, activities it engages in, programs that are put in place that promote this type of idea.
There were some deeper things also present in your book. There was quite a few things, like we have just now talked about, that is enough to alert the citizens, alert parents and grandparents that they really need to be more aware of the long-term implications of things that are happening with their children. But there was also some very disturbing, deeper thoughts that you had. One of the phrases used was the final solution for conquering America.
Right.
I think we know what the final solution would refer to. So,
Correct.
Explain how that could fall into place.
Well, that comes out of my history background, being a history teacher. That's why I chose final solution. And I say that because 97% of children are educated in the public school system. So if you want to impact an entire nation quickly and easily, it's through those public schools. And the final solution, of course, is to lead us down the road toward a socialist society where we're dependent on government. And I believe I have a chapter in there titled The 235-Year War Against America, which is now 236 because we just had July 4th. But in that war, I said at the beginning, it was America against the world. Britain, France, even the Civil War. European nations were hoping that would divide America, conquer this experiment, as they called it, in democracy, and allow aristocracy to take over again. But we stayed strong, survived a lot of issues and attacks and whatnot. Beginning in the maybe 30s or so, maybe even before that, the battleground changes focus. It's no longer foreign nations attacking us. It's the attack from within. It's that socialist mentality that, you could go back to FDR and see it in the New Deal, but especially since the 60s rebellion with this redefinition of our values, and that comes into the school system, and that's where that attack is. And the war is still there. It's just from a different place. It's no longer on the battlefield, is how I portray it. It's now in the classroom and on the television and in pop culture. So, I think that pretty much gets to the gist of that.
Oh, thank you. There was a mention of Plato's Republic.
Yes.
I remember briefly from years ago
Right.
some things about that, and explain a little bit about how that figures in with your book.
Plato's Republic, yes. In my book, I talk about Plato because I was introduced to him while I was working on my teaching license. And it was very shallow. It wasn't a whole lot emphasized. So I decided to buy the book and let me see what Plato says. Wow. When I got that and was going through that thing, it really turned on some lights. And two things I can say about Plato's Republic. First, I think the school system in society, there's a certain ideology out there that's kind of replicating what Plato talks about. And he talks about schools where you train kids according to the values of the state. And you train kids toward the happiness of the state as opposed to the individual. And some other socialistic type of ideals in there, wealth distribution and other things. And so I get into that end of it and how our schools kind of imitate that and how certain ideologies in our country promote that. The second thing I talk about is there's a lot of behaviors in Plato's time that are also occurring in our culture today, such as child-parent relationships, where kind of the child is running the show now, and healthcare and socialized health care that we're talking about now. And I think Plato is experiencing those just before the downfall of Greece. I think we're experiencing some of these things just before the downfall of America, unless we get back on track. So there's definitely a mirroring between what Plato talked about and was experiencing and what we are seeing today in America.
Very interesting. There'll be, I'm sure, some people who will want to check that out a little bit more because it is something that we hear. You also mentioned in the book some similarities between the United States and ancient Israel.
Absolutely.
Our destinies, how is that?
Absolutely. The last chapter in public education gets into the potential judgment that America faces from God. And what I do is I draw parallels between America and ancient Israel. For example, ancient Israel had 12 tribes that received a land, plus the Levites was the 13th tribe. They did not receive land. In America, we had 13 colonies. Jesus had 12 disciples. That makes 13. So I kind of put that 13 together.
I see.
And I compare Israel going from Egypt to the Promised Land, to blessing, to prosperity, to sin, to eventual punishment. And I kind of paint a similar parallel with America. Christian faith of our founders, our colonists, the settlers, they allowed America to become great. We've now cast those aside, as the ancient Israelites did before their punishment. And I think God is sending us some messages. You better turn it around, or we will face a similar punishment as Israel did. If he punished his chosen people, he's not going to ignore America.
Right.
And you can look at Isaiah, you can look at Ezekiel and some of those Old Testament prophets that definitely draw parallels between what they were talking about and what we're seeing today.
If parents or grandparents want to know a little bit more about what is actually being taught in their public school that is different from what they were taught, I know the subtle changes in the textbooks and things like that. I've been on a textbook committee before, and it's a very hard thing to do because you have to choose pictures that the kids are going to enjoy. It has to be modern. It has to be up to date. You have to have colorful bullet points. You know, so sometimes the actual text is only one part.
Right.
And it was very hard for me to come to grips with the history that I studied is not what my grandson is studying.
Exactly. It's tough. You can go to a school and ask for a copy of the textbook. If some schools don't use textbooks as much as they used to, as far as kids bringing them home, they may have a classroom set that they use in class. So you can go to the school and say, can I receive a copy of the textbook? And they should give you one. I would if a parent came to me and said, can I see the history textbook? No problem at all. Another thing they can do is with the state standards that are out there now, and a lot of states have signed on to what is called the Common Core standards.
Yes.
Which all states will teach the same thing. Right now it's just reading and math. Well, those are available online. You can go to your state's Department of Education website and just look up state standards or school curriculum or whatever. It might be titled, and you can review what is taught in your school.
Well, thank you. I really admire you for standing up for the things that you believe as a school principal. I know that may not always be easy.
Right. Well, thanks. I appreciate that.
Is there a website, or is there any other information out there that we might be able to?
Yeah, there's several things you can do. If you want to order the book, Public Education, winepressbooks.com is one place to order. They also have a phone number, which is 877-421-7323. Or you can go to my website, which is the Education Agenda. And there's also a links page on there where I have current articles that explain the attack against our faith, some things that are going on in schools, and some stuff like that.
The Education Agenda, is that .com?
Yes,
theeducationagenda.com.
Correct.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with
Awesome.
us today, Jeffrey.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.